Welcome to the first in a series of lectures on HTML tables. During these, I'll teach you everything you need to know about incorporating tables into a web page. In this first lecture, we'll cover some of the fundamental questions, like what is an HTML table, what are tables used for, and which HTML tags are used to build them. If you're already familiar with the concept of HTML tables, feel free to skip to the next lecture where we'll start building them using HTML code. If not, stick with me here and I'll take you through some useful table theory first. Here we can see a basic table. A table is really nothing more than a grid or a series of data cells arranged in straight line rows and columns. In this table we have 3 rows and 3 columns, and together they give us a total of 9 individual data cells. Each of these cells can contain their own HTML content, but we'll get back to that a little later. The purpose of a table though is to make sure the data in these cells line up. Here we can see straight lines running between the rows and columns, keeping the cells in line. This alignment means that cells 1, 2 and 3, for example, all appear on the same row. Likewise, cells 1, 4 and 7 all appear in the same column. Because these cells are all part of a table, their content will always line up, either horizontally or vertically. Let's now move on to more advanced table concepts, where we'll start to look at cell merging. Here, we may want to merge cells 1 and 2 together. When we do this, we turn 2 cells into 1 and we shuffle the others around. Now cell 1 takes up the width of 2 columns, and as a result, we've lost cell number 9. We can also do this vertically. If we want to merge cells 5 and 8, we can do just that. This will reshuffle the cells again, with cell 5 now taking up 2 rows, and we lose cell number 8 in the process. So now that we know what tables are, let's explore what they're used for. As I mentioned before, their primary purpose is to line things up in some form of grid layout. In today's internet, that means organising data into easily readable rows and columns. Let's look at an example. Here we have a page from Wikipedia, which provides information on the tallest buildings in the world. If we zoom in closer and scroll down, we can see a table containing the names and stats for the buildings. This type of data is a perfect example of why we need tables. Imagine all this data just displayed in a series of lines. It would be extremely hard to visually pick things out like the building's city or its height because nothing would line up. It would just be a huge block of text and we'd have to read through it all just to find the information we wanted. Using a table though, we're able to structure the data so that we can easily scan left and right to read rows of data or up and down to read columns of data. We'll come back to this table in just a moment, but before we do, I want to touch on a little bit of history of HTML tables. I just mentioned that tables are used for organising data. However, this has not always been the case. In the past, tables have also been used to lay out entire web pages. It turns out the same grid methods that made them so useful for laying out data were also useful for structuring parts or all of a web page. The grid on the left is pretty self-explanatory, as it divides the data into cells. On the right though, we can see an example of how a developer may have split up an entire page using tables. While modern day best practices tell us that tables should never be used to structure the layout of web pages, some companies do still use them for this purpose. Even if you don't do it yourself, it's something you'll almost certainly come across if you get a job in web development and you end up supporting other people's websites. It's therefore important for us to discuss it here so that you're prepared. Let's take a look at the homepage of Wikipedia, for example. Rightly or wrongly, a large part of this page is actually structured using an HTML table. This whole section here, in fact. I'll overlay a grid to highlight where the table exists on this page. We can see that the developer has used a table with 3 columns to separate the content. The first column contains the green content. The second column is a very thin blank spacer column to pad things out. And the third column contains the blue content. In this example, they've only created one large table row with everything sitting within it. But it's a real-world example of where a table has been used to structure content. I'll go over why this approach is not recommended in a little while, but as you can see, this still does happen in live websites. Of course, if you're watching this lecture at some point in the future, then this website may well have changed, but this practice is definitely something that you will come across. This is not the only case either. We can see other examples on major websites such as Amazon. If we go to the Amazon website and scroll down to look at the footer navbar, we can see another example of a table. In this case, they've created a table with 4 main data columns, plus 3 additional spacer columns to create gaps between them. Let's inspect this page using Chrome's developer tools so that you can see what I mean. To access these tools, you can right-click on the element in the web page and select Inspect. As I move my mouse over the table tags, it highlights the section of the web page they relate to. So we've now looked at what HTML tables are used for, both now and in the past. However, I mentioned earlier that we shouldn't use them for page layouts when building a new website, so let me explain why. In the past, HTML tables were the only method available to create structure. But as things evolved, CSS was introduced, and with it came new methods for creating page layouts. Methods such as CSS Grid and CSS Flex, among others. These new CSS methods are much more flexible than tables, and provide full control over how the content is displayed and how it reacts to different devices. This makes CSS ideal for laying out websites that work across all manner of devices where content can be arranged depending on how wide the screen is. This is something that tables just can't do, and it's why industry best practices tell us not to use tables to lay out web pages anymore, but instead use CSS. As I've mentioned before though, there will be a lot of websites out there that still use tables to structure their pages, so it's important that you know how and why it was done. In many cases, it doesn't necessarily make them bad websites, it's just that they may be older sites that use outdated technology. I'll cover the newer methods in our CSS section later in the course. For now though, let's get back to our tables. Let's look again at the data table from Wikipedia. This is a fairly simple table with the exception of maybe the height columns. If you remember back to the start of this lecture, we looked at how we can merge cells together across rows or columns. Here's an example of exactly that. The height column header actually spans 2 rows. Also, the header cell containing the word height spans 2 columns. We'll look at exactly how this is done in the table lecture on col span and row span, but for now it's useful just to see this in action on a real world site. Okay, so now that we've discussed what HTML tables are and what they're used for, let's look at which HTML tags we can use to build them. We'll delve into more detail on these tags in the following lectures, but so you know what's coming up, the tags are table, tr, th, td, thead, tbody, tfoot, col group, and caption. If you're ready to jump in and start creating some tables of your own, head on over to the next lecture where we'll start off with the table, tr, th, and td tags.